For Ukrainians, the stakes in America's presidential election couldn't be higher. Helping Ukraine used to be one of the few things Democrats and Republicans agreed on. But Donald Trump has refused to spell out whether he wants Ukraine to win this war. With polling showing Trump and Harris neck and neck, Ukrainians are trying to make sense of what a second Trump or a Harris presidency would mean for them.
I think Zelensky is one of the greatest salesmen I've ever seen. Every time he comes in, we give him $100 billion. But he should never have let that war start. That war's a loser.
If Donald Trump were president, Vladimir Putin will be sitting in Kyiv and understand what that would mean for America and our standing around the world.
Putin in Kyiv was a scenario most Ukrainians thought was off the cards after 2022. But Donald Trump has put the cost of supporting Ukraine at the centre of his pitch to American voters. And that's forced Kamala Harris to respond after a campaign in which she's been trying to steer clear of foreign policy. You would think Ukrainian sympathies would all be with Harris, and for the most part they are. Volodymyr Zelensky told New Yorker magazine that Trump, quote, doesn't really know how to stop the war, and called Trump's running mate J.D. Vance's ideas to end the conflict dangerous. But it's not all that clear-cut. There is very real frustration in Kiev with the Biden administration and its Vice President Kamala Harris. And since Ukrainians don't get a vote in this election, their policymakers are having to map out what they'd do if Trump gets back to the White House and look for potential upsides.
Trump is unpredictable, he is risky, he is quite skeptical about our prospect, but at the same time, he was the first to provide javelins. He is also the one who promised to bomb Moscow and Beijing. Harris is much more predictable. She is definitely will repeat some of the Biden's mistake, and that is being undecisive in some crucial moments of helping Ukraine.
Ukrainian politicians worry that a Harris administration will be dominated by Biden-era foreign policy thinking they see as too fearful of crossing Putin's so-called red lines. For instance, by allowing Ukraine to use US long-range weapons against targets in Russia. Current US support, these critics argue, is enough to prevent Ukraine's army from collapsing, but insufficient to inflict real damage on Putin and force him to end the war on terms Ukraine can agree to. But if Ukraine needs more rather than less US support, how could it ever expect that from a man like Donald Trump, who never misses an opportunity to complain about what Ukraine is costing Americans? To many observers, and Kamala Harris, Trump's often repeated claim that he can end the war in 24 hours sounds like code for forcing Ukraine to capitulate by pulling the plug on US support. But some Ukrainians think they can still win Trump over. They point to previous Trump policy U-turns and suggestions from his advisers that they would increase aid to Ukraine, albeit only if Putin fails to negotiate.
There are some of our stakeholders who are still convinced that Trump will change his mind. And they, as Ukrainian government, will be able to convince Trump to see Ukraine as, first of all, a good image-building opportunity. Ukraine is a success story for Trump.
Aside from the politics, there's also the human side of this equation. While Trump makes no secret of his admiration for Putin, Trump and Zelensky have serious baggage. Trump was impeached in 2019 over allegations he pressured Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden's son's business in Ukraine. For all that, Alexander Kyiv is convinced Trump and Zelensky have more in common than first meets the eye.
They are politicians of the same approach to foreign policy. They are all about individual approaches, individual contacts, acquaintances. He still views Zelensky, as he said, quote unquote, a good salesman. And I do believe that from point of view of Trump, a good salesman is a compliment.
And then there's the question of money. The US has so far provided Ukraine with approximately $100 billion of aid since Russia invaded in 2022. That's less than 5% of the US defense budget over the same period, but it's unpopular with American voters all the same, and not just with Republicans. Seen from Kiev, there is another way. If the US and Europe were to confiscate and not just freeze hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian assets in Western banks, then American taxpayers wouldn't have to foot the bill of defending Ukraine. Russia would. If Ukraine's leaders can convince Trump that the price of supporting them is coming down, then maybe, just maybe, they can change Trump's mind if he wins the White House on November the 5th. And if Harris wins, it's a message from Kiev she won't be unhappy with either.
Nick Connolly filed that report and joins us live from Kyiv. Ukrainians are dealing with another night of deadly Russian strikes. How concerned are they about an election in the US?
Look, there is a level, obviously, to which people here are concerned with their everyday life and are very busy just staying safe and trying to earn a living. But equally, these stories are very clearly very relevant to Ukraine, given its dependence on the US for particularly military aid. Europe obviously gives a lot of financial aid, but the military aid is, the biggest donor is the US. People here don't have a vote, so they can't influence. Lots of people I've spoken to say, well, we'll think about it once it's happened, once we know who actually is going to move into the White House. We don't have any way to influence this, so why worry? There is obviously a lot of coverage of Trump's statements. People roll their eyes when he says that he can end the war in 24 hours. No one buys that here, albeit some remember that Volodymyr Zelensky said similar stuff when he was elected in 2019, that he could just basically end the conflict in eastern Ukraine with Russia by talking to Putin. But I think some of the things that really have cut through are the reports about Trump's personal relationship with Putin, even having left office, that he was in touch with Putin directly over the years. That is something that really worries people, and they worry that basically Putin is speaking to Trump when there are no officials around, that he's basically being able to influence Trump in a way that Ukraine isn't, even though Ukraine is, the biggest recipient of US aid, theoretically America's ally in this part of the world. So that is a real worry, and people are hoping that there is maybe some way that they can still get past that and kind of win him over.
Does Kyiv have a strategy to deal with a second Trump presidency?
Well, definitely we've seen Volodymyr Zelensky trying to build bridges. It's a difficult relationship because, our viewers will remember that Trump's first impeachment was all about allegations that Trump had tried to get Zelensky to dig up compromising information on Joe Biden's family and his son's business here in Ukraine. So it started in a really difficult way. But we saw on his last visit to the US, Zelensky meeting Trump. That was a meeting that was only confirmed last minute, so they were really working to make that happen. And we saw Zelensky trying his best to keep out of kind of the partisan US politics, standing next to Trump and only basically contradicting him when Trump said that he had as good relations with Moscow as he does with Ukraine, saying that he hoped that Ukraine would have better relations. I think they are trying to convince Trump that Ukraine is not going to be as expensive to the US in the future as it has been. They've been pointing at ideas to confiscate Russian assets and use that money rather than asking US taxpayers to pay. And he's also, I think, stressing the point about the US image in the world and basically the perception of American strength and Trump's strength, frankly. That basically, if a Trump White House dumps Ukraine, pulls the plug on the sport, that will have very serious consequences for Trump's prestige in the world, and hoping to kind of use that angle and that kind of side of Trump's vanity to get him to think twice about reducing that support.
And what could Ukraine expect from Kamala Harris, in your opinion?
Well, she's, as we've seen through his campaign, not said a great deal about what she would do. She has said a lot about what Trump would mean for Ukraine, but she hasn't said a great deal about the kind of nitty-gritty. In terms of the kind of atmospheric, she does seem very still kind of on message from Ukraine's perspective. She still repeats, the lines about Russian basically running roughshod over Ukraine's sovereignty, about the need to support democracies like Ukraine. But there is a worry that, firstly, she's going to have lots of other things to do if she wins this election, and that the Middle East is taking more of her attention. And then there's the second problem of, getting, basically from Ukraine's perspective, that American permission to do more. Right now, they realize they're getting a lot of help, but they say that spending too much time thinking about Putin's red lines, not allowing Ukraine to attack Russia with long-range weapons from the US, is going to just drag this out and basically not allow Ukraine to up the price of this war for Putin. So there's definitely some tensions there with the Harris team, albeit on a totally different level than the ones they have with the Trump people.
And if US support wanes, how long could Ukrainian forces hold off the Russians, just briefly?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Certainly, there are supposedly contingency plans being drawn up to see how Ukraine could fight on with European support without that American support. And I think from a political point of view right now, there's no real scenario that you could see the Ukrainians just accepting that and kind of rolling over and capitulating if Trump pulls the plug. But certainly it is going to be very, very difficult because there is just no other country that has that level of military preparedness and those kind of stocks of weapons that are just kind of rolling into Ukraine. Other European countries are buying stuff for Ukraine, but it has to be manufactured and it's been taking months, if not years, to arrive.
Nick Connolly with the very latest for us from Kyiv. Thank you.
Now, Bruno Lété is visiting professor at the College of Europe in Brussels. He's an expert on transatlantic affairs. Welcome to DW, Professor. What's your reading of how Kyiv policymakers are gaming out the two likely US election outcomes?
Well, I think first we need to understand the different style between Harris and Trump. Harris' foreign policy is much more value-based, where basically, the role of autocracies versus democracies matters, and where the United States is also prepared to take a self-cost to meet its international obligations. That's more or less the Harris style. Trump here is very different. Trump's foreign policy is much more transactional, always thinking about what's in it for the United States if I have an international obligation. And in this respect, Trump doesn't like war. Trump doesn't like conflict. War is bad for US business. So, a Europe at peace and more stability in Europe is more interesting in this matter. So I do believe that somehow we will see Trump indeed pressuring Kiev to make some sort of deal on this conflict. I would say a deal not unconditional, not because of sympathy for Putin, but really, again, because Trump is thinking about what this all means for the United States, and this conflict in Europe costs a lot of money to the US taxpayer.
OK, so under a President Trump looking to bring this to an end quickly because of the cost, under a President Harris, what?
Well, I think under President Harris, you'll see a continuation of what's happened with President Biden, basically. The United States will keep delivering military assistance to Kiev, but that military assistance is just enough for Kiev to defend itself, but not good enough for Kiev to win the conflict. We've seen that the West overall, whether it's the United States or Europe, there's a limitation to the support they are willing to provide. So in some sense, yes, Harris will support Ukraine, but is that support enough for Kiev to actually make its way out of this very difficult situation where it is in today?
And what about European countries? How prepared are they to step in and deal with this war on their doorstep if a President Trump pulls the plug on US military aid?
Well, in some way, the European approach is just the same. We see that European countries are providing military aid to Kiev, but again, it's not enough for Kiev to really win this conflict. We also see divisions inside Europe. The countries closer to the Russian border are obviously more in favor of all-in support, but countries further removed geographically from Russia are more hesitant. So I think here again, Russia is actually keeping the pressure on. We see that the situation on the front line is very difficult. And I do believe that Europe or the West as a whole is approaching a hard choice to make. Either the West really ups its military support for Ukraine, it gives what Ukraine needs to win this conflict, or it will have to accept some sort of deal, some sort of end to this conflict.
OK, thanks for talking us through that, Professor. Professor Bruno Lété from the College of Europe in Brussels. Thank you so much.